Good morning, Abundant Life Church. This is Pastor Chris, and today we're going to continue our look at Romans chapter 13, verses 11 down through 14. Paul had listed some sins that we shouldn't do: drunkenness, debauchery, orgies, bad stuff. And included on that list were things like dissension and jealousy. Why are these seemingly minor sins, seemingly far less harmful sins, listed with such awful things? Well, you might think, aren't all sins bad? Maybe that's what Paul was saying here. Big or small, all sins are bad. Well, yes, that's true, but it needs some explanation. All sins are violations of God's will. So does that mean we shouldn't separate sins by degrees and that we should treat them all the same? Should somebody who is going 65 in a 55 zone be considered just as bad as somebody who committed murder? People make that theological argument, and frankly, it's just silly. Yes, all sin is a violation. All sins are wrong, but not all sins are equally damaging. And they shouldn't be treated like they are all equally damaging. Common sense tells us that. Trying to treat all sins as though they were equally damaging simply isn't the answer. I remember there was an old Star Trek episode. It wasn't the original one with Captain Kirk, it was the new one with Picard and all that. But they're on this strange planet. They're always on a strange planet. And they had eliminated all crime. And the way they eliminated all crime was by only having one punishment, the death penalty. And a crew member was sentenced to be executed because he walked on the grass when he wasn't supposed to. So the death penalty for walking on the grass. Will a system like this work? Of course not. It's silly to think that it would. But the problem is that we could go the other route and say, if not all sins are equally damaging, then there are some sins that we can just go ahead and do because they're not that big a deal. You can just dismiss it and say, jealousy is not that big a deal. All right. In the face of drunken orgy history, yeah, maybe jealousy doesn't seem to be that big a deal, but then we have to ask ourselves, why did Paul list it here? He must have seen that there was danger to them after. So now we have to find out what that danger is. Why is a lesser sin, like dissension, so dangerous? Is it as dangerous as big sins like debauchery? We need to find out what Paul was thinking here. All right. Now, apparently, there is a real danger to some of these so-called lesser sins. The problem is how these lesser sins, let me start that sentence again in English this time. The problem is how these lesser, harder to see sins work versus how the major ones work. All right, let's take something like drunkenness and compare it with a sin like jealousy. Which one is more noticeable? It is really hard to be drunk and not have people notice. But it is really, really easy to be jealous and not have anybody know. And that's the problem. Remember, the reason people sin at night, like Paul was saying, act as though it's the daytime. The reason people sin at night is so they can hide. These lesser sins are hidden. They're easier to hide. People don't see more subtle things, more covert sins like jealousy or like this passive aggressive causing of dissension. People don't know you're sinning. You don't even need the night. You can do these sins in broad daylight. You can do them in a church. They happen in churches all the time. You can be in a church sinning up a storm and no one knows it. You can get away with these sins, and the beauty of it is, even when people do know it, they're afraid to call you on it. How many churches are destroyed by somebody that everybody knows is a problem, but nobody wants to stand up to them? I got a call years ago from a good friend of mine, Bill Putman. He was kind of a church planting guru. He had planted many, many churches, was known all over the West Coast, incredibly respected man. And he was in Central Oregon planting a church. And he got a call from a very difficult church in a nearby town. And this church had a history of just running off their preachers, and they were always fighting about something. They were an angry, mad little church. And he called me up and said they wanted to meet with him to discuss what it would take to get a new pastor. And he wanted me to come with him. And I said, would you want me to prepare something? Do you want me to present something to him? He says, no, I just want you along as a witness. That should have been my first warning. Well, we get there, and this angry little church, they're all gathered in their conference room, and they're mad, and they're just grinding their teeth at how angry they are over the last pastor and the pastor before him and the pastor before them. And then they're mad about the pastor they're going to hire, even though they haven't even started accepting resumes yet, because he's not going to do things their way. And I noticed this was all led by one woman. We'll call her Sylvia. And Sylvia was doing 90% of the talking. And you could tell that everybody else was intimidated by Sylvia. And she's going on and on and on. Everything is negative. And finally, my friend Bill, who's leading the meeting, just turned and looked at her and said, Madam, I don't think I'd want to be your pastor. Ooh, it got quiet. And Sylvia said, no, I'm very easy to get along with. And she pointed at a woman across the room and said, Lois, just tell him I'm easy to get along with. Poor Lois is going, yeah, she's easy. Here's the problem. I was sitting right next to Sylvia. I had to get up and leave because I thought bursting into laughter at this point will not be good. Bill called me the next day and said, do you think what I said is going to come back to bite me? And I said, yes, of course it will. But it needed to be said. You see, Sylvia controlled that church. And nobody would call her on her negative attitude and her complaining and her constant whining and undermining. Was that sin? Absolutely. And it wasn't even hidden sin. Now, compare that to somebody who has a problem with alcohol. Compare that to somebody who has a problem with sexual sin. Okay. Those sins are damaging. There's no getting around it. They destroy families. But I haven't really seen too many churches split over somebody's drinking problem. I have seen churches split based on sexual sin. But to be honest with you, I've seen way more churches destroyed by dissension and jealousy and these sins that we don't think are that damaging. You know what animal kills the most people? It's a virus. Viruses kill more people. Viruses are tiny little animals, microscopic things. They kill far more people than rhinoceroses. Now, if a rhinoceros is charging at you, it has your attention. It's hard to hide a rhino, but it's very easy to hide a virus. Sometimes these smaller, less noticeable, almost more acceptable sins that we never call people on, they're the dangerous ones. We'll talk more about this next time. Till then, have a great day.